Your wife is disgusted by your lack of self-confidence. Welcome to Masters in Manhood podcast, episode 7. Sven, we're on number 7
Mm.
with myself, Jeff Allen, and Sven Masterson. And here Sven and I talk about spirituality from the place of a secular approach and also from a religious background. And I think I want to start with real quick as we do, Sven. So I grew up with a secular background. My folks were religious when they were younger, but they were baby boomers who decided to let me decide on my own, which
Mhm.
meant, I didn't have a particular framework for values, or certainly not religious when I was a kiddo. And so it really took me until I was about 30 years old to start to look at things other than just the materialistic, external, superficial way of life. Like, okay, I work, I make money. I'm going to invest in real estate because that's how 7 out of 10 people grow wealth. And so I just want to check all these boxes. And until I was 30 years old, 29 years old, that's how I functioned in life. And I realized, this isn't really doing it for me. We were talking before I hit record. It was soul sucking. I felt like I wasn't on purpose within my life, and I knew I needed to find a different way to look at this. And so I started to look into spirituality more from the secular point of view, from within myself. And so for you, when you grew up, what was your background quickly for that?
A little bit of everything. I mean, I grew up in a evangelical Protestant home. I think like all kids tend to do, you just accept what your parents tell you until you're maybe in your teens. And then I flatly rejected everything my parents taught me. Um, and just kind of pursued my own thing for a while. It got pretty dark for a number of years. I eventually kind of came back to a faith perspective, but I'd made it my own by then. Um, and then struggled, to be honest, with that inner conflict between what I felt was a true expression of faith that felt like true, in the sense of it felt life-giving, and like it really had substance to it. But I struggled for probably 15 years or so, trying to rectify that with what I saw in the institutions where I had learned faith. So I had this kind of rub between, well, this is what I'm encountering in my personal private experience of faith, but then when I go in a corporate setting, I see this, and it did not sit well with me. Um, and so, kind of long story short, I ended up leaving institutional faith, and a lot of people don't know what that means, and it scares other people, and I'm sure a lot of religious people will judge me for that. It just means I left any kind of formal institution where they codified what faith needed to look like for me.
Mm.
And that's something you don't know this, Jeff, because you're not from this background, but you're strongly admonished, warned, and um etc. Like, if you do that, you're gonna fail. You're gonna backslide. You're gonna turn into a horrible person. You're gonna be doing heroin, and gonna be in the gutter and sleeping with prostitutes, because you just can't be out there without this institution, kind of telling you what's okay, what's not okay. But I haven't been part of an institution for a decade, and I have a vibrant expression of faith as a family, as a person. But what I would say now is it's authentic. It's not shaped for me. I'm not averse to hearing other people's perspectives, but I have for my whole life been really independent in my thinking and unwilling to just wholesale accept other people's ideas. Um, but I'm also not ignorant. I have a degree in biblical studies. Not that that really means anything, other than some group of men in the world thought that I deserved a kind of a piece of paper that said I study these things. So I don't really count that as anything, but I'm a seeker and a learner, and I appreciate my faith perspective, but I also have learned in my 48 years to be less dogmatic, to be more open to curiosity, and that if my faith does not allow me to be curious, that should be cause for suspicion. How secure has my faith allowed me to be if I'm not able to ask questions, which I'd have to say is kind of a fundamental part of the human experience. Like, so if I have to deny the curiosity of being a human in order to be safe with whatever made humans, like, to me, that doesn't work, right? So anyway, that's kind of my faith story in a nutshell.
Yeah, well, that's one thing I appreciate about you and our conversations here, Sven. So since that when I was 29 and decided, wow, I need to really start figuring out from the inside, from my heart, what does my soul want and the path that I want to be on. And those 15 years since then, I appreciate talking with men that have been on the path, even from a different perspective. And that's actually going to segue fantastically into our talk today. You mentioned so an external source of rules, validation, you need to be like this, otherwise you're going to be a garbage fire, right? This external source of reliance, really, and that's what our topic is about today. And so first, I wanted to show the dictionary definition of spirituality, right? So the quality of being concerned with the human spirit or soul as opposed to material or physical things. And that's what Sven and I were speaking about. That's the aim of the Masters in Manhood podcast. And of course, this call is to look at things beyond just the material and to look deeper into mission and purpose and who are we and how do we guide ourselves. So our topic of today is, well, my wife is disgusted because I lack self-reliance. She's disgusted by a lack of self-reliance. So self-reliance, reliance on one's own powers and resources rather than those of others. And since we have a quote spiritual, not necessarily just religious, but secular and religious discussion about spirituality, the depth and soul, I decided to go to Google and look up Christian self-reliance. And this was one of I think it was the second search result that came up from openthebible.org, moving from self-reliance to grace-reliance. I thought this would be a fantastic topic starter for today. I prepped this with Sven yesterday, and it seemed like a fantastic. Sven got fired up about this, so I'm curious. I'm really looking forward to this. There we go. Open the Bible, moving from self-reliance to grace-reliance. And here was one of two major points from this article. I'm not going to share much of the article, but man is weak. Do you live as if you do not need God? Here are two quick things to remind yourself of that will move you back toward a reliance on God, that man is weak. So Sven, we're weak. So we need to rely on an external source of rules and guidance and leadership and validation, because we should be relying on spirit instead of relying on our own selves.
Well, there's a lot in there, man. How much time do we have? Because I could probably do a seminar on this. Let me just start in the beginning with the end. I think Christians are confused about self-reliance, largely, many of them, most of them maybe, because they're confused about self. And actually in ways that are unorthodox to ancient doctrines of faith, right? So even if, and I know, Jeff, you're not familiar maybe with the scriptures in detail. And so when I mentioned scriptures, I'm talking about what would be the Torah in Judaism, the Old Testament in Christianity, and the New Testament in Christianity, right? So in the Torah / Old Testament, you have the book of Genesis. Is the very first book. In the beginning, God, right? And let me just paint a little bit of like the understanding of the human form, because it's essential. You can't talk about self-reliance if we can't define self. And a Christian or a spiritual person is going to have a hard time appreciating what we mean by self-reliance if we can't nail that down. But it says in the biblical creation account, listen, God formed Adam from the dust of the earth. So you have this account of the creator just taking the dirt and creating a human. And it says in the scripture that he breathed into his nostrils and he became a living being. And that breathing into is the word spirit, right? It's I think in Hebrew it's like ruach, which is the word spirit, but it's also the same word for breath. So here's my point: spirit and breath are synonymous. And if a Christian who values scripture, and most who are going to have a problem with self-reliance would probably consider themselves as people who are very concerned about honoring the word of God this way. If they read that, it's the most rational way to read that is when the creator breathed into Adam, his spirit entered the body, he became a living being. That's like what it plainly says. Now you've had children, I've had children. Were you in the delivery room when your son was
Yeah.
born?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay. So you remember that anxious kind of weird spot? It's actually a really emotional spot, I think, for a lot of us, where, you know, your baby comes out, they're like purple, their
He had a huge
eyes
cone
might be
head.
blinking.
Huge cone
Yeah,
head.
it's ugly, but there's this moment between the time they come out, they haven't taken their breath yet, and it's this weird spot in that they're like, they're not animate. I don't know how to say it any other way. Then
Yeah.
they take that first gasping breath, they fill with color, their eyes change. Like there's a whole dynamic that changes. The umbilical cord is cut. And what's happening is the breath is coming into them. I think it's very, very similar to what's talked about in this Genesis account, right? And so the baby breathes, they cry, and you cry maybe because you're like, whoa, what was that I just witnessed? I just witnessed the animation of a human being in a very profound way, right? And then hopefully you haven't watched a lot of things die, but if you've ever watched a person or an animal die, when that breath leaves, we call that death, right? The word inspiration, to which we it's interesting how we use this, by the way, which means to put spirit into. We use that as a way to talk about being life-giving. And expiration is when something is, you know, the life comes out of it. And so that's our understanding. Even if you're not a religious person, we know that when breath comes into and breath leaves, that life is starting and life is ending. Okay, so when you talk about self, you're either the spirit, the breath coming into and out of, or you're the body. Which is it? Which do you think it is as a person from a secular background? Are you just the material clump of things that are born, or like what role does breath play into you as a composition of a human?
Well, that's a great question because I always thought of myself up until again 29, so all through my childhood and things, that you are just this clump of your body and you are how people see you. Are you
Yeah,
accomplished in the world? Are you going to be a
yeah,
doctor and or a lawyer like your
yeah.
grandparents imagine? And that felt incredibly shallow through most of my life, honestly, right? And looking back on it, that's why I went on the path to find more, because it couldn't be just that clump of body.
Right. And see, I feel that's great that you're saying that. I think that would surprise a lot of people who might be watching this who are from a religious background to think that, oh, a secular person is here basically admitting a biblical worldview. Like you just described basically an accounting for human life that matches Genesis, right?
Mm.
And yet the Christian is saying, I'm not sure I could be self-reliant. Now, I just want to point this out, not so much for you, but for the religious person watching this. In Genesis, it says the creator breathed that breath into the nostrils of Adam. Okay. A Christian's general confession, if they're at all biblical literate, is that the creator is perfect, that there's no darkness, evil, wrongness in the creator. So what would be the nature? I'm asking you because we've never had this conversation. And as just a person unfamiliar with this, I want to see if you come to these conclusions. What would be the nature of what is breathed into a human if the creator, with those attributes, breathes into a human form? What would that inspiration, that spirit, what attributes would you expect it to have?
Well, if the creator is perfect, then it would be a perfect breath. Yeah. I mean, it would just replicate what it is. He
There
is.
you go. There you go. It would kind of, it would withstand, it would actually defy ration and logic and even scriptural understanding that what the Creator breathed in would be tarnished, right? And people would say, oh yeah, but Adam, he hadn't actually done anything wrong yet. Okay, well, that's a different issue, but not really relevant, meaning the breath, the pattern in the scriptures is the breath going into there gives animation, is kind of meeting a union with the body, animating that thing, and then breath leaving, done, right? So when you see that picture, you see basically a facsimile, and the Genesis says this also, that Adam or humans were created as the Hebrew word literally does mean like copy of or imager of, but as the image or copy of the Creator. So you have this human created as a copy of the Creator and then inspired by the Creator. Now, fast forward, I don't know how familiar you are with the story of Adam and Eve, but they picked this fruit that the Creator said, don't eat that. And the day you eat that, you'll die. It was the ability to discern between judgment and evil. I would call that judgment, thanks to our brother Rob, who pointed that out to me. Is a great way to see that. And then they're like, oh no. So you got perfect creation, perfect creatures here who learn to judge, and then they say, there's something wrong with us. And they put fig leaves over themselves and they hide from the Creator. The Creator shows up in that story and says, where are you? Right. And then they say, well, we hid because we were naked. And the Creator says, well, who told you you were naked? Right. So there's no indication up to this point that the Creator has found fault with his creation. Instead, he recognizes that they learned something that actually caused them to hide. Right. And this is why I believe Christians get very confused, because the general teaching in Christianity is that somehow the very nature of the human, which as a spiritual person, even in secular, we just talked about, is spirit, that you are your spirit, the thing that comes in and out of your body, not merely your body, right? And so when you talk about self-reliance, and you brought up verses like weakness and whatnot, the broad understanding in Judaism and Christian faith, in the scriptures anyway, is that the weakness comes from that you are a spiritual being living in a body that has limitations, right? Not that there's something wrong with you, like I'm weak. That doesn't really jive. Like, how could you be made in the image and reflection of a Creator, literally inspired with that Creator, and you, the spiritual being, be weak? I would suggest you can't. And it's actually the confession of New Testament authors and plenty of Old Testament ideas in scripture, that our problem, our weakness, is the vessel that we live in. I think that's a fair thing even for a secular person to say. Are you going to die one day?
Yeah, of course.
Do you consider that a limitation of the human form?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Right. Do you get sick?
Absolutely.
Does your body ever want anything that your spiritual self within has a different desire for?
Well, that's a great question, because my body wanted, of course, many different things when I was young,
Yeah.
prior to even knowing what I was aware. And what I found is, yeah, the spirituality, which in my opinion comes from my own perspective, and this is, I want to ask you about this actually.
Okay.
So I felt less fulfilled, not filled in my heart, prior to finding these ways of looking at my own self, existential understanding that I am someday going to die and that my body does have limitations. Because when you're 20 something, you don't ever think, I think you're never going to die.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And so understanding the passing of time and the small frustrations that I had, let's say even in relationship or in career, once I had a larger, deeper, more heartfelt understanding, the small fights that I would have with my spouse, or the trouble that my child would have, or his crying or his tantruming, started to become much less important than this bigger, grander thing. Right. So, yeah, absolutely. I felt that my body had limitations. And when I had this grander perspective, this existential perspective, it brought me a lot
Yes.
more power. Right. So I would guess a religious person might say, well, you brought God into your life. And so
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
so what would you say
Right.
to
But
that?
a person from institutional faith has gotten accustomed to the idea that God is only in the life of people who believe. But
Uh,
that doesn't jive with the book of Genesis. And it certainly doesn't make sense that if you get fast forward to the New Testament, to the Gospels about Jesus, that and maybe you're not familiar with that, but basically, 30-second nutshell, the idea in Christianity is that the formless God that breathed into humans, but because of being formless, can't relate to humans, incarnated, that just means became human to walk among us so that we might relate to the Creator, teach us some things, and then basically give us a way to understand redemption from shame so that we could escape living in the consequences of what Adam and Eve encountered by judging themselves, right? Um, where was I going with that? So, I kind of lost my train of thought about why I brought up that
well,
in
if
the
I
first
if
place.
I brought this different perspective, this more spiritual perspective, and let's be clear, I don't believe in God in
It's
the
okay. Yeah. Yeah.
conventional sense, but wouldn't a religious person say, well, you brought spirit into your life, so then therefore, yeah, you are weak without spirit?
You're dead without spirit, though. Again, the biblical confession is my point. Like, literally, to be without spirit is to be expired.
Hmm.
There is no, in a biblical worldview, um, life without spirit. But that what has happened in institutional faith is we've gotten this idea that there's like quality of spirit, meaning, like, unless you believe the right things, your spirit is detestable to the
Hmm.
Creator. And if you believe the right things, then your spirit is good with the Creator. But that would fundamentally mean that it's your knowledge, that it's having some sort of measurable rightness that makes you either acceptable or unacceptable to the Creator. And that's my problem with it, because that negates really goodness being sourced in the Creator. It is all up to you getting it right. And how do you know when you have it right? Like, if I were to say, if I were to follow that line of thinking, then I could say, okay, the number of 100% represents how much rightness you have to have in order for the Creator to be happy with you, and for you to have the thumbs up, or for you to have spiritual life or be saved in the Christian vernacular. What if I'm 99.99999%? Then what, right? Or 98%? It gets to be ridiculous, because how would a person possibly know that they had met the 100% criteria, right? And this is a huge theological problem if you're actually a thinker, because if only some spirits, like, again, going back to the definition we kind of outlined in the beginning, are are actually acceptable and good, and the rest are not, then you have to have a way to sort them out. And no specific spirit could know they were okay if they couldn't say, I've checked all the boxes. And they'd have to check them perfectly. So there's no path actually in that way of thinking to actually spiritual security, to having confidence before that Creator or before anybody else that you're okay, because you don't have a way to prove to yourself, I've done, I've made God happy. And you know what's interesting is that's exactly how most Christians live. Despite their theology being different, they live practically in a state of, if I don't get this right, if I'm not right, I'm in big trouble. This is why, and, and I'm being as objective as I can here, and I'm curious what your thoughts are. Uh, Coaching people every once in a while that are from faith is when I'm working with a person from a religious faith background, they have more shame, they're more defensive, they're more argumentative generally, and they're struggling more actually than the average person because they are really, really, really needing and betting on being right. Now, if being right is actually what makes you acceptable before God, this is kind of the dilemma for the Christian is what purpose whatsoever does Christ serve in that story? Completely unnecessary for there to be a Messiah figure or an incarnation of a creator if you just need to be right. Right. And the reason I'm also bringing this up is because that need to be right shows up in Christian marriages all the time. Because the guy that's used to having to be right because his existential future depends on being right, needs to be right in every argument he has with his wife, everything he thinks, and you know from talking to guys how that shows up. Now, getting back to self-reliance, if you think yourself is, I don't know, it's good and bad, then you're going to have a hard time with self-reliance because you're going to think, you're going to read into verses like you showed a minute ago about weakness as being associated with the spirit within you.
Mhm.
And I don't think that personally is actually congruent with good sound doctrine. Meaning, if you do a broad study of scriptures and you understand the at least dualistic nature of human composition between spirit and the body, when you put weakness in the body, or what the New Testament calls the flesh, which or psyche and whatnot, then and I think you would even agree with this by your own confession. Yeah, our bodies are weak. So if I said that to you, does that verse trouble you? Do you disagree with the idea that we're weak if we understand that weakness is tied to your body?
Well, this is great. This is where I want to go with this as
Okay.
well, because our ego never wants to feel weak. Our ego always wants to achieve and be safe and make more than we did yesterday and have her touch our penis more than she did yesterday. And, so
Mm-hmm.
that we like know we're good for half of a minute. And then we're wanting the next thing within our ego.
It likes
And
to check boxes, but is what you're
exactly.
saying.
So that's a parallel that I want to go to in the work that we do with men is she is sometimes seen her opinions, wife's opinions are he thinks he needs to try to check every checkbox. And if he doesn't get her approval, then he's nothing. And he validates himself off of her approval of him, her view
Okay.
of him. And there's no win there. There's no way for him to ever feel fulfilled or honestly feel anything but weak if he's always looking to an outside source of validation of
Okay.
checkboxes.
Okay. Could I interrupt you a minute?
Yeah.
Did you just mean to correlate a man living in his ego with the Christian? Because you just basically described what I describe as how people live a Christian life, and you attribute it to the ego. And I would actually agree with you that most people that believe they're living a life of faith are just living in a complex egoic system of checking boxes to be approved. And that's completely different than the message of faith, which is actually a message of knowing something about your spiritual composition, the spirit, and the value and worth of that as being innate and intrinsic. I'm just curious if you made that
Yeah.
correlation.
So yes, and then the next step of faith, like we've talked about this quite a lot with my son, for instance, right? He had a lot of trouble in school. He's 18 years old now, living with roommates on his own, and things are very different than they were 3 years ago when I was in court with him multiple times, and him being asked to leave school and all these things we've talked about before. And how do we breathe? How do we inspire into a positive future, into him believing in himself regardless of the external voices or judgment that he's had? Sure, yes, he's made poor
Yeah.
choices, but then also how he's been judged. And how do we breathe into him? How do I breathe and see a positive future for him? It's faith for me. It's faith in his future, not in a
Yeah,
religious.
no, I think that's brilliant. I would say you're operating more in faith than a person from faith at that moment, because
That's what I wanted to ask about, because it's, as you said, egoically checking boxes is not faith.
if what you described of that ego is the human, is all you are and is life, you don't have a philosophically rational basis for encouraging your son, because the best you could do is tell your son, you got to be perfect or life is just going to suck. And I think it's kind of interesting that a father who's honest with himself knows, well, that's not a very life-giving way to be as a dad.
Yeah.
If I have to encourage my kids to be perfect or else, that doesn't feel very loving, right? Um, and most parents would say, man, I don't parent that way. So if you wouldn't parent that way, and you would quickly say, that's a soulless, really jerky way to be, then why would we think that the creator of the universe might have the same relationship with us? Like if a creator exists and you're a better parent to your son than the creator is to you, to me that's a big red flag. Like,
Yeah.
well, how did that happen? If I'm made in the reflection of what made me, can I be better than that thing? Like that would be irrational, right? And also too, you know it instinctively in your insides that your son is more than his check boxes, right? And you would never say, son, I tell you what, I don't love you right now. But if you go out and check these boxes, I promise, son, I'll love you, right? Like,
Well, don't we inadvertently do that to our own selves, or we put ourselves in that frame with our woman as well?
we are doing that. I would put that
Mhm.
back to shame, meaning if you judge yourself as unworthy, that actually is what, in my opinion, gives birth to the ego at a young age. Meaning we encounter shame, and shame is like, what I mean by that, I don't mean the emotion of shame, just to be clear here. I mean the judgment of self and the conclusion that I don't meet whatever the standard is. And when kids encounter that, and you know this from being a teacher and in mental health, when kids encounter shame, they start building a version of themselves they believe other people will find worthy, right? I would equate that with the fig leaf in the book of Genesis, meaning when we feel naked and exposed and like not enough, we hide and we put on a facade that we're like, hey, how's this look, right? And that shame drives us the rest of our lives to say, well, I can't be me, right? This woman will love me if I go out and make a lot of money, if I get my muscles a certain shape. And so you start living the rest of your life with this complex fig leaf, let's call the ego, that you're under the belief that that is how you will get love and adoration and worth, and really solve your existential dilemma, which is, am I okay? Right?
Mm.
That all came from judgment. And one of the ways I've seen the proof of this, having raised, I have 6 kids, but I've raised 5 of them, from infancy, is they're born with no fig leaf. Like kids don't, they quite literally, they dance around naked. They'll run down the street naked. They don't care, right? They're like little honey badgers. And then around age 6 or 7, suddenly they're like, hey, I don't want anybody to see me naked. And they move from like, I can do anything. I'm gonna go to Mars. I'm gonna be a rescue, this or that. And they start like saying, I don't know if I'm good. Right. And then it gets worse and worse and worse. And then you get married.
And then you
And
get
by
married.
then your
Yeah.
fig leaf is majorly complex by the time you get married. Right. It's 6 feet thick, and the woman doesn't know you. And I personally have encountered in my own marriage and in the marriages I help men with, that marriage will force you to either take your fig leaf off or run away, find a new partner, and build a new fig leaf that's even thicker next time,
Mhm.
right? Because it will force you, and you know this about the feminine. The feminine says, that doesn't feel authentic to me. You don't feel real right now. I feel like I'm feeling your ego. I would
Yeah.
I would synonymize that with a woman saying, I'm thinking I'm seeing your fig leaf. Can you show me what's behind that? And a man's like, no way,
Yeah.
no
It
way.
feels all that
I
shame behind it. Yeah.
shame, and like I'm way too insecure for that. But a woman will become more and more and more distant in a relationship the more and more she feels like you're not real. And that creates a crisis for a man, but I see it as a great opportunity because we never needed that fig leaf. I would suggest we were never not enough. That was a conclusion. If you go back to the biblical narrative as a way to understand this, Adam and Eve concluded on their own by beguilement from the devil in that story that they weren't enough. It was never the creator's pronunciation, hey, you're not enough, cover up, right? In fact, the creator rejected their fig leaf, and it was more like, hey, if you're going to wear something, a covering, it's going to be one I give you. And that's a whole other theological concept here. But getting back to self-reliance, if I go another route real quick, I think it's just as simple as this. There's a lot of codependent people in the world, and a codependent Bible scholar or a codependent Christian author writing an article is going to see the scripture through the lens of codependency, and they're going to see their relationship with a creator as codependent. And I've encountered a lot of codependent leaders in my 40 years in institutions, and they're the ones that read that codependency into the text and conclude, well, I'm not good. And so I can't be self-reliant because, again, they're confused on self, and they're mixing together the ego and the spirit, which are two different things. But if you put them together, you can't conclude that self-reliance is good because you naturally know your ego is no good, right? Like,
Well, this,
it helps you, but I'm saying you also know it's weak.
well,
That
right.
it,
That's so I want to come back to, I'll show a second screen here in a second
okay.
about
Am I getting
codependency.
too deep here with any of this?
No,
Or?
this is good about codependency, but I want to circle a little bit later back to that we may have never needed the ego. And to me, I didn't think of it that way. It was, I didn't have exposure to any kind of spirituality. I mean, my first form of spirituality literally was going for a walk in the forest.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I was a kid, I loved to climb trees. So at a very painful place in my life, when I was 29, 30 years old, I said, fuck it, I'm going to climb a tree. And I climbed a tree up to the point where I felt, that visceral nervousness that you're climbing too high. And I thought, this is perfect because it gets me out of my head. And I would sit against the tree, and I would think about, what is this tree seen all throughout life, and help me expand my concept of time. It helped me get into the present moment because I was so high up in the air. That helped get me past my ego, or to rediscover, as I suppose you would say, or to discover something deeper, discover underneath the fig leaf, really.
Yeah.
But so we could get back to that. And I mean, that's something I teach men, you teach men, of how to find self-reliance, how to pull back the curtain.
Real quick about that. I don't think the ego is fundamentally bad. Pardon me. I think the human brain has a mechanical model of self, you might call that, in the brain that we call the ego, and that's what it is. If the human frame, the machine, is a machine, and in the kind of biblical worldview I'm talking about, where you are the spirit that inhabits that being, then the being itself is amoral, meaning it's not bad or good. It's just a machine. Just like if you turn around, it looks like you have a keyboard there. Is that keyboard good or bad? It's a machine, right? That machine has properties. It has a need for certain things to work. And so I don't think the ego is the problem. The problem becomes if the ego starts to judge good and evil. That's a big problem. Like if your keyboard started judging good and evil and it didn't have everything it needed to do that, it's going to start to judge incorrectly. And if you look at, like, from a human psychology standpoint, and this idea of the ego is just your sense of self. But as soon as you start judging good and evil with a machine, you start making incorrect assumptions. And then, because the way our sense of self is mechanically, we keep building our sense of self based on experiences, right? So if you judge incorrectly one time in your human frame, next time you're in that opportunity, your brain relies on that last time to inform it about this time. And you see how one little seed of judgment and judging incorrectly can just corrupt the human experience at the ego level. I personally believe that's exactly what happened. And then you give birth to children. They have certain experiences in their human life, and what they're experiencing is a bunch of people who are living in kind of the state of judgment. Like they judged incorrectly, and they're living in a story that, oh man, that bad thing's about to happen. And so I think the machine of the human is fine, but once you introduce judgment into that machine of the mind, we screw ourselves, right? We live in a state of judgment, and that state of judgment leads to shame. And I personally, and I would challenge you with this, have you ever met a human being that doesn't encounter shame, or that has not felt ashamed, that they haven't felt that they missed a standard somewhere? To me, that's the problem. Anyway, we can revisit that
Well,
in a minute.
that's part of this work. That's part of men's work is if we continue to try to check boxes, use the judgment of our ego that we've learned through culture or family or whatever it may have be, painful experiences, and we translate that to our wife or our external circumstances in this moment, there's no way to know. There is no way, as you said earlier, to 100% know the correct way to do life, and it isn't done that
You
way.
can't escape shame, right? You
Yeah,
can't get out
so
of shame in that environment.
exactly, exactly. So when we're talking about self-reliance as far as spirituality here, I mean, it's if you would have told me when I was 20 something, I'd be having a spirituality question, I thought you were crazy. But so
Yeah, it's
that's why
fun.
I like talking about this with you, because I don't see it from a religious point of view. I see it coming from within me. And a religious person may say the same words but
Well, I see it as coming within me too.
yeah, that's why I want to ask the next
Again,
question. Yeah.
if the creator breathed into both of us, um, and that's how our life started, right? And forget about at the moment needing to attribute this to a creator. You breathed in and you started living. I breathed in and I started living, right? Now, if that is what I think is my nature, like it's the thing that came into me at breath, and I believe that's tied to, if not the creator, then, and I believe that's self. Now, this is why Christians, they're afraid that you're going to be claiming to be God. I'm not claiming to be God. I do claim to be connected to the creator, because that's the biblical confession. It's very clear in the Hebrew and Christian scriptures that we have union with the creator. To me, if the creator breathes into me and when I take that breath away, I'm dead, that's a pretty good indication there's a union there. So to be self-reliant is to be spirit-reliant. And if that spirit is the spirit of the creator, then self-reliance and reliance upon the creator are synonyms. See what I'm saying? Does that, I hope it makes rational.
Self-reliance and reliance on the creator are synonyms.
Yeah, like to me, there's no difference because I'm not seeing myself as ego. I do not rely upon the ego. To me, self-reliance is 100%, 180 degrees different than ego reliance. I think to be relying on the ego is foolishness.
I see.
Right. And I think you'd confess, like, if I rely on my ego all the
Oh,
time,
totally.
sometimes it's going to protect me, but it's going to screw up every relationship I have. I'm going to be a horrible parent. I'm going to be in fear and anxiety and all kinds of stuff. So
Yeah.
that's what I was saying. We have to get clear on self. If self is your ego, you should not be self-reliant. That would be a disaster. If self is your spirit and is connected to the divine, then to be self-reliant is to be divine reliant, because you're in a union with that creator, which is what.
I think I see where the bridge is going here. So, for instance, if a gentleman was religious sitting across from you and he said, I need to rely on the creator, I think your point is that is within you from a religious point of
It
view.
has, yeah, that's why I kind of marvel that people from a faith perspective have an issue with self-reliance, is because, I mean, I could take you to scripture after scripture after scripture, Old and New Testament, that speak to this idea that to be in a relationship with the creator is to be in union, oneness. In fact, it's not just oneness, it's inseparable. oneness. So if I'm inseparably in a union with the creator, this is a rational question, knowing nothing about doctrine. Is it reasonable to be self-reliant if self is spirit?
Well, that's where I'm going in my mind right now as you're
Yeah.
attempting to take a man underneath the fig leaf to the spirit that has always been there in a religious perspective, and the where the ego is not going to serve the ego of check boxes and trying to always have it particularly right. So
Yeah, and the
if it's
Bible would call that the flesh.
yes,
Um,
so let me actually ask you about this slide. This is the
okay.
second point in that article because I have no idea where you would go with this. So I'm curious. Jesus made himself weak to save us.
Mm-hmm.
At the right time, Christ died for the ungodly.
Yeah.
What does that mean to you? Because I have a hard time
Well, I
getting
look at
that.
this different than a lot of people would. First of all, let's talk just get on the same page. The, Jesus is the incarnation, that creator embodying human form so that we could relate to the creator, because being pneuma, being breath, like it's kind of hard to have a relationship to something that's intangible and outside of material existence. So the confession of Christian faith, not Judaism, is that the creator became human, walked among us so that we could relate. All right. To walk among us, as a creator, to inspire into a being, is to take on human form. We've already said this human form is weak. It dies, it gets sick, it can be injured, right? And so I would say it has to mean that. Now, can I point out something interesting here?
Yeah.
The first demonstration you used of weak, it was proof that there was something wrong with us. So if I use the same logic to interpret that verse you just showed me, I would have to actually say that there's something wrong with Jesus, that Jesus became as such where something became wrong with him, which is a huge theological problem, because he would be disqualified now to actually be revered as the creator if he is weak like we are.
Yeah, these are
So
the 2 points from that
yeah.
article.
So if man is weak and Jesus is weak, by that argument, Jesus cannot be God and cannot be the Messiah, which actually defeats a Christian's core doctrine and core belief. And what I'm talking about, that man has the weakness of the body, and Jesus, God incarnate, makes himself weak, takes on a body, totally congruent, no problem there, right? To take on human form for the creator is to take on voluntarily, to embody oneself in a container that is weak, just like me, right? But without actually depriving himself of godness. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's what
Maybe.
I was wondering. That's what I'm wondering about this. Again, I have no basis, but why did he have to make himself weak to save us? You're saying just becoming within
Yeah,
the
that's what I'm saying. Like,
within the
yeah,
flesh made him quote weak. Is that what we're saying?
yeah, and actually that would be congruent with other scriptures, like okay, think about it this way. Think about the humility
Of God to
involved.
become human.
If yeah, and that's the reason I don't say God, is because one, God's a generic term borrowed from pagan tradition, but also because we tend to think of God as having like an old man in the sky and
Mm.
as having a location. But the biblical concept of God, or the creator, or Yahovah, different names, is really this formless force that is everywhere, all powerful. It has characteristics that you might say are human, like it can love, it can care, it can be even angry, it can be watchful, right? But it's really important to understand it's not one place. Like, you couldn't go see God over there and then God moves over there. Like, that's called um a local understanding, meaning God is non-local.
Mm.
Okay, so
Sure.
to have this massive thing, force,
Yeah, the force from
divine,
Star Wars then. Okay. Yeah.
that's bigger than the material universe. This is why I don't like to equate. I don't think the universe is big enough for us to think about as a divine force. Even quantum science is giving us an understanding that there's something that sits outside of the material universe. at a quantum level. Okay, so whatever that is, think of the humility necessary to like compress that down and take on a human form and pop out a vagina and need to nurse, right? And need to grow up and wear diapers. Like that's what I would suggest that means about becoming weak, becoming frail, entering the human story with us as a peer, right? That's a significant stepping down from power and everything that a creator would enjoy without being in human form. And that's what makes the idea of incarnation significance and endearable, is that the creator would do that. You understand?
Yeah, I do. Let me
Okay.
take a step forward and to finish just the piece of the article I wanted to
Okay.
share, right? So don't be self-reliant, be grace-reliant. And what we've been talking about is basically that, well, how you define grace, but that is the same thing. So I would say this: grace reliant is to have faith within myself that's beyond the ego, that's under the fig leaf, as you were saying. Faith within myself. Where am I going? What are my values? Defining that for myself. And also faith within the future of my son, as we were talking about. So don't be self reliant, be grace reliant. I'm not sure if this will serve us in our conversation, but just to finish this up, Christ has released us from the chains of self reliance, which kept us bound.
I would say ego reliance there would make a whole lot more sense in this article,
Or
but yeah.
ego reliance.
Or
Okay.
flesh reliance, another way to say it.
Yeah, very good. Jesus has slain sin once and for all through the cross, making a grace reliant spirit real, present, and possible. Christ holds the keys to our freedom from the temptation and sinful patterns of ego reliance, which are
Yeah.
rooted in the idolatry of and belief in ourselves. So, how about this
Yeah.
part?
I disagree with that part. Let me explain why. Christ holds the keys to our freedom from the temptation and shameful pattern of ego reliance, right? And that's not rooted. I don't think it's. I think it's the source of idolatry, not the roots of it. So back up for a minute. Okay, remember I told you, like, once you start judging, you start concluding yourself to be worthy of judgment, to be not enough. Follow me?
If we're in the
In
swimming in the
the
pool of judgment, it's going to flow both ways. It's what it
If
sounds.
you're swimming in the pool of judgment, you're going to determine your worthiness, your self-worth, as it's going to go like this, right?
Fallible, yeah,
Yeah, it's going to be majorly fallible. It's either going to be I checked enough boxes or I can never check enough boxes. Either way, neither one leads to peace and fullness and wholeness in an individual. Can you agree with that?
Yeah,
Regardless of
absolutely.
spirituality.
Yeah.
Okay. So if you look at the work of Christ, the only way out of that feebleness, with a vacillating back and forth between feeling good and feeling horrible, which is what shame does, is to convince a human being that they meet the criteria to not be judgeable. Right? You have to defeat shame in order to have wholeness and wellness as an individual. You must. All right. Take the incarnation for a second here. You have the creator of the universe incarnates into a little baby, grows up, teaches us, demonstrates that they're really the creator through the miraculous things like healing people, which kind of it creates an authentic proof. This dude is probably telling the truth, right? Because I just saw a blind person gain sight, or I just saw somebody raised from the dead. Then in our misunderstanding of who that person, because it was religious people, by the way, that crucified that incarnated baby. Then we bury this guy in the ground. We don't want your kind around here. Now think about how crazy that is for a minute. And then even death can't keep that incarnated creator. And so that incarnated being who died now comes back from the grave, right? And says, you know what? I don't want you to be ashamed anymore. I took care of it. This is a story you can live in, so that when you think about being not enough, all you got to do is look here. Like I'm telling you, you're good, right?
Yeah, that doesn't make sense to me at all as a as far as why does that all of a sudden absolve any
It's
issues?
not about absolving. Remember our original remember your original problem is that you learn to judge and you conclude yourself as you're only worthy if you check the boxes.
Right.
Okay, so if the God of the universe could show up in front of you and prove to you that you're acceptable to that thing, to the God of the universe,
Okay.
okay,
Regardless of any judgment.
regardless of checking boxes,
Uh-huh.
could say, Jeff, cut it out. You're not judged. If I don't judge you, why are you judging yourself? You're good. We're good, right? Took care of it. I'm going to prove it to you that I have the authority to say that. Kill me. Go ahead, try it, right? And then I can't kill you. Okay, that's a pretty good story
Okay.
to be able to look to and say, well, if the God of the universe told me there's no basis for my shame,
I see.
right? Meaning, hey, I don't judge you. That's go look it up yourself. The creator says, I don't judge you. I don't come to judge you.
So I think where you're, if I may, I think where you're going with also back to following biblical doctrine is that
Yeah,
it's not in that way. It's you have to be perfect. It is checking the boxes. It is trying to be perfection.
that's
So
what the
is
ego does. Yep.
if I may ask, right, is that where some of your I don't know if dissent is the right word, but your critique of the way some men live by the
Yeah,
Bible
100%.
just
Yeah.
becomes egoic, and it's their misunderstanding or misrepresentation of the story that you're trying
Right, because it diminishes actually that story. The beauty to me in the scriptures is this idea because it's totally free. Notice in that story when the creator incarnates and comes and says, "Hey, I don't judge you. First of all my boxes are checked. That's me speaking as the creator. The creator's perfect. And if my boxes are all checked and I say I don't judge you, I think you can have confidence that you don't need to be judged, right? Um, that's beautiful to me. That's like saying, hey, I don't want you to check any boxes. I already love you how you are. To me, that's life giving. Every human being can recognize the power in that, that uh, a force saying, I have no judgment for you. When you have such a beautiful thing and then somebody comes along and tries to put you back under checkboxing,
Mhm.
to me, they're not only putting you back in the bondage of judgment and living in the ego and shame, they're also pissing on, I would suggest, that story and that work. Like if the creator came to relieve people from shame by saying, I don't judge you, and I'm here in human form to tell you this, and you're gonna kill me in the process because you're not gonna believe it, but I'm good. I have the power over life and death. I hope you believe this so that you can live without judgment. And then we put people back under that. That's a horrible, horrible, horrible thing. And that's my problem with institutional faith is it actually has returned people to shame. It just gives them a new fig leaf with new symbols on it instead of actually encouraging them with the same words that the creator used in Genesis, which was, who told you you were naked? And if you follow that story, I know it's a complex story to follow, especially if you're not from that background. If you look at how things unfold after Genesis, it's like, hey, they put a fig leaf on, and from the rest of the story is about the creator trying to redeem that situation, trying to put it back where people understood they were okay naked. But institutional faith has focused on the consequences that we encountered from shame instead of shame itself.
So Sven, what
So,
would you say, and honoring our time here, we have about 10,
yeah,
15
sorry,
minutes left.
sorry.
So what would you say to the man from a biblical perspective? Okay, I don't want to live in the egoic check boxes of the fig leaf and,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
try to, or by the way, as we've said earlier, make your wife that force, make your wife God in that you're trying to check those boxes. So into like my journey started 15 years ago.
Yeah.
Curious what your perspective is from the man who's in that biblical place of, okay, self-reliance isn't egoic reliance, but self-reliance of the spirit within you, let's say. And I may have different words to this, but I'm curious what you might
Yeah.
initially say to that man who's coming
Well,
from.
when I talk to people who are from a faith perspective about this, the first thing I have to do is establish what self is. And because people of faith have a reverence for the scriptures, it's not hard to take people to scriptures that say, look, it says it right here that you're complete, you're whole, that you're in him, which that is that the implication there is that you have this union with this perfect being who cannot be imperfect. So you can't be joined to the creator if you're imperfect. That's also another pretty solid doctrine of faith. So my first work with the man who's from that background is to help him understand in his framework why self in his worldview is not the ego, is not the flesh, but is the spirit. And once we understand that, and we understand when we talk about self-reliance, at least he and I'm not talking about ego reliance or body reliance. I'm talking about spirit reliance. But understanding that the when you're in union with something, it's really, it's kind of irrelevant where the border of one starts and ends, right? Like if I put a tea bag in hot water, I can't take them apart anymore, right?
Yeah.
Well, the tea or the water can't take each other apart. So they become one. And if you put a person into this divine thing we call the creator, and there's a oneness, then to be self-reliant, if myself is in that union, is totally legit and is synonymous with being reliant upon the creator. I think it's actually the only way to honor a relationship with the creator is to be self-reliant or spirit reliant. To me, there's no incongruence there at all. I think actually it's completely irrational to speak otherwise, because the moment you say I'm God reliant, I'm Christ reliant, is to see yourself as separate from. And if you're separate from the creator, the scriptures would say you don't know him. You're not in a relationship with him. Actually, separateness is the problem. So I think Christian theology gets very confusing here, and it confuses a lot of people. Then you throw in that codependency, and people are like, they live this codependent way, right? They're like, I got to yield to my pastor. I got to yield to my rabbi. I got to yield to this famous Christian author. I've got to yield to my wife. And you know as well as I do, men in that role are living horrible marriages. Now, if Christ came to give people a great life, why is the Christian living a horrible marriage? Either he's wrong in his understanding or his God is impotent. And to me, it's like, which one of those does he want to be true? I would rather have the humility to think maybe I'm wrong than my creator is impotent.
Well, then you can control from there. You can take responsibility and control from there. And I'll say that sounds very similar to the way I see things
Yeah,
from
they're not really all that different.
from a completely different angle or
Yeah,
perspective, or which is that, I don't want to live through the fig leaf of my ego. It wasn't fulfilling. I had lots of success in many areas of my life, but I still felt my soul completely empty. And I switched my career over into psychology and education and special education, and filled my soul. And now I've brought all my skills forward into having our own private, we each have our own private practice, right? So I'm not saying, I visited Southeast Asia. You've been to other countries. I don't want to be a monk in the Himalayas. So there are success I want to have in my life, but what is it fueled by? It's not a constant checking boxes. It's not a seeing if my woman is happy with me right this moment. How about right this moment? How about right this
right,
moment? It's
right.
coming from within. So when you say, this, you have to be acting from this spirit from within your own self. I had to declare what that was for me. What our values are those? What is that? What are the boundaries I want to move forward on? What do I believe from the inside when when I stop trying to check boxes, what's left?
Right. So I would say at some point, the problem you're going to run into, or people with a completely secular worldview tend to run into, is when you're your own authority for what is acceptable and not, right? And I'm not debating you in this. I'm just saying this is a philosophical problem. When you set the bar and you meet somebody with a higher bar, then you start comparing, and then you start shaming yourself. Like,
Mm.
man, he's got it way more dialed in.
When you're thinking from the ego, you mean, right?
Well, it puts you back in the ego. Maybe you're really
Yeah.
living a spirit led life in your scenario. You love how you're showing up, right? Um, you love what you're about. You love what your values are, and you discover. But someday you discover something within yourself, right? Like you see a list of, hey, these are great attributes in a man, and you're like, oh, I'm missing 3 of those, right? And then you made the comparison, you judge yourself, and you concluded, I'm not enough. There's something wrong with me. So, I mean, if you're not experiencing that, great. I'm just saying, in my own life, trying to live outside of an understanding that my creator sees me as perfect, then when I'm the standard for perfect, it can shift as much as the ego can. And if I compare myself to even one other person, I might conclude, man, I miss, right? And then I'm back experiencing shame. And then you start, your sense of well-being is topsy-turvy. I would still suggest, having known you for a number of years and guys that live in your thinking, that I'll just be straight up authentic. You have more sense of security and well-being and spiritual confidence and confidence than most Christians I've met, because they are oftentimes living in the ego. And so their shame is all over the place, where I think when you realize life cannot happen in the ego, that's bankrupt. That's a major improvement, right? Now, the way to epitomize that, I would suggest, is to live cognitively inside of a story where you cannot be ashamed, and this is the benefit, when whatever is the most supreme thing in the universe has demonstrated and proven to you that you're perfect, there's no reason for judgment anymore. Like, you lose the judgment. And if you lose judging yourself, you lose shame. And if you lose shame, then you lose everything that motivates you to go get other people, like a woman, to tell you you're okay. And to me, that's the big benefit, is you get a rock solid spiritual confidence that we talk about. We have emotional confidence, behavioral confidence, spiritual confidence. It's the belief that I'm okay. To me, the distinction of the message of scriptures is, if understood correctly, it forms the basis of a spiritual confidence that is 100% unassailable. Like, you can't take that person's security away, and therefore they can live outside of shame. And if you can live outside of shame, you are living the epitome of human life.
Yeah, well said. The living outside of shame, and that's attractive. That's attractive to a woman. That's going to help you be more successful in career and joyous within your own self. I mean,
Right.
that was the journey of when I felt down at the most like difficult time when I was 29, during that phase of my life anyway. Having only comparison, only comparison to, career and how much my woman loved me in this exact moment and how much sex she wanted to have with me. That was the only basis for how I judged my own self in that moment. And
Yeah. Yeah.
growing up, going through that, above that, beyond that, under that, deeper than that, that's been my journey. And it sounds very similar, but from a different direction.
It's also the way to stop living in the ego. I mean, the ego is there to it's the brain. It's strategizing how to keep you safe. So the nefarious nature of shame is that if you feel ashamed, which is a conclusion, I'm not enough, your ego goes into hyperdrive, how can we solve that problem of not being enough? Oh, we got to check more boxes. We got to check the getting a woman to think I'm an alpha box. We got to get the bigger penis check box. We got to get the bigger muscles check box. We got to get the bigger income check box. Right. So the only way out of that check boxing is to eradicate shame. But when you do that, the ego, it becomes kind of impotent and powerless because it's no longer trying to strategize, how do we keep this guy safe from the consequences of not being enough, right? So to me, that's the gift. And if you look at the scriptures that way, it's pretty easy to see that that's the offer on the table.
Yeah, well, and how much time and thought and energy is freed up in life? How much is taken up by shame and comparison? And that's a huge piece. That's a
Yeah,
huge piece
all of it, pretty much.
So, and I love this conversation.
Yeah,
I'll
me too.
close this out.
Thanks.
This has been super fun.
Thanks for
Yeah, I
talking.
grabbed this picture, which looks like a man sitting, I would say, on the West Coast, if I just look at the rock formation off the coast there. And so if you're watching this, first of all, thank you for being on this journey with us. There's many men that have told me and Sven that they love these masters and manhood calls. And often we have Mark Dreska with us, who unfortunately wasn't able to be here today. He had some flooding in his home, it sounded like. But if you're this man sitting on the coast, looking out into, let's say, the remnants of the sunset and the waves, what would you be thinking about your own comparison right now, your judgment, your ego, your fig leaf? Is that what's permeating your mind? Is that what's really filling your life? Is these check boxes? And if you want to feel less of that shame, and if you want to join us, not only with Sven and myself, our communities, the communities of men, of hundreds of men that we've worked with, we'd love to talk with you about that and show you what that's about. Sven, I haven't shown this before. This is what I call my morning kingly plan, which I do most days within the, let me not lie, 20 minutes that I sit on the toilet in the morning. And you could
That's the
do
foundation
many.
of men's work right there, is the
Yeah,
great
exactly.
work.
Your
Yeah.
throne, which is the toilet. And so if I wanted to give someone some actionable movement toward understanding your own values, uncovering, getting underneath your ego, these are some that I created for my own self. This is a tool that I teach within my work. And number 8, the boardroom is a topic for a different time, but the rest are fairly self-explanatory. Find something you appreciate, read something inspirational, one page of something inspirational to you, and asking yourself the question, what do I know to be true, can lead to so much more exploration. And there's more there as well. If someone watching this, a man watching this wanted, okay, what are some actionable things I can do and within 5 minutes or 10 minutes in the morning, this is the first piece that I would give him. And like I mentioned, Mark is often here with us, but he's not here today. So you can find me and Sven at these locations. My website is greatmenmovemountains.com and Sven at mentoring.men, or there's our email addresses as well. Sven, fantastic. I love being your brother and having these conversations. This was
Yeah,
fun.
me too. Me too. It's
Right.
actually easier to talk to you than most religious people, which is kind of funny. Yeah.
Right on. Well, I'll take that as a compliment. It's
Me
good.
too.
Right on, Sven. We'll see you guys in episode 8 next time. Ciao.